Imagine you're a parent, and the voice that has guided your entire life, the voice that's provided literally everything you have, suddenly speaks to you.
Right.
And it asks you to destroy the one thing you love most in the world.
It's unthinkable.
It is. I mean, how do you even respond to that? What happens when the absolute baseline of human civilization, like the rule that you just do not take an innocent life, suddenly collides with a divine command?
Yeah, it really feels like the ground just gives way underneath you because, we want our morality to be this solid brick wall.
Right, totally clear.
Exactly. Clear, categorical, with zero gray areas, especially when it comes to the ultimate questions of life and death.
But today, we're taking you into a story that basically shatters that brick wall. We're stepping into some deeply challenging moral territory by looking at Genesis 22,
The Akida.
right? The binding of Isaac. This is that ancient, famously controversial narrative where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son.
And look, if you read that narrative purely on the surface, it feels entirely incompatible with the idea of a good God. I mean, it looks terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is why our mission for you today is to, well, not treat this like a simple Sunday school lesson.
Right, we're going way deeper.
Yeah, we've pulled together this massive stack of incredibly dense philosophical and theological texts. We are bringing in heavy hitters like Immanuel Kant, Søren Kierkegaard, Thomas Aquinas, alongside modern ethicists.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, but we're going to treat this as a rigorous, high-stakes ethical case study, just to see if this story can actually withstand modern moral scrutiny.
And to even begin defending a command like this, we first have to ask a very foundational question about how moral rules actually function out here in the real world.
Makes sense.
Because we assume a rule like do not take innocent life just operates in a vacuum, right? Like it's completely inflexible. But ethicists point out that even our most common moral intuitions admit exceptions based on the environment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there's a brilliant analogy in our sources that makes this really concrete. The surgeon analogy.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
Right. So imagine you're looking at a close-up photograph of someone plunging a scalpel deep into a person's abdomen.
Just out of context, looking at the physical act, you're basically witnessing a horrific, violent assault.
Exactly the point. But the moment you pull the camera back, and see the sterile operating room, the anesthesiologist, the patient who gave prior consent, nobody calls the surgeon a criminal.
No, of course not.
Right. The conditions surrounding the act, the medical benefit, the intent to heal rather than harm, they completely change the moral category of what is happening. The physical action is identical to a knife attack, but the moral reality is entirely different.
And what's interesting is that both classical ethics, so thinkers like Augustine, and modern secular ethics, align perfectly on this structural point.
Really? They agree on that?
Yeah, they do. A moral prohibition isn't an unbreakable law of physics. It's what philosophers call a defeasible rule.
A defeasible rule.
Right. Meaning the rule stands until certain extreme conditions override it. I mean, you see this in Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous trolley problem.
Oh, sure. Where you have to divert a runaway train to save 5 people, but I
Right.
mean sacrificing one.
Exactly. Or, you see it in the really agonizing decisions of September 11th when authorities had to weigh the defensively permissible act of shooting down hijacked planes full of innocent passengers.
Just to prevent an even more catastrophic loss of life on the ground.
Yes, it's heavily conditioned on the background facts of the world we live in. And there's a thought experiment from philosopher John Hare that pushes this to its absolute limit.
Oh, right. I remember this one. He asks us to imagine a world where God arranged human biology differently, right?
Yeah.
Like suppose when a person turned 18, they briefly, quote unquote, died, only to immediately wake up a moment later, restored to robust, perfect health.
Yeah, and in that specific biological reality, the act of, quote, killing an 18-year-old wouldn't be a crime.
Right. It's just a transition.
Exactly. It wouldn't carry the moral weight it does in our world because the finality of death is totally absent. The horror of killing is grounded in the finality of death.
So if the background facts change, the moral weight changes,
Mm.
which forces us to ask, what were the background facts for Abraham?
That is the big question.
Right. If we're going to judge his actions, we have to look incredibly closely at the specific reality of his life before he ever took a single step up that mountain.
And what's fascinating here is that Abraham was emphatically not operating in a vacuum. He had this massive covenantal guarantee.
Right, from God.
Yeah, and the text signals this heavily. Looking back at Genesis 12, 15, and 17, God repeatedly promises that Abraham's lineage will become a great nation, and God specifies that this lineage will run directly through Isaac.
Not just any son, but Isaac specifically.
Exactly. There's even a vivid ancient Near Eastern ritual in Genesis 15 where God essentially issues a self-curse, promising to be destroyed if he breaks his word to Abraham.
Wow. So by the time we get to the mountain in Genesis 22, Abraham is holding two completely competing truths.
Yes, see it.
Like, God says sacrifice the boy, but God also said the promise runs through this specific boy.
Right. And either the promise will be kept or it won't. And the text tells us exactly what Abraham concluded.
What does he say?
He leaves his servants at the bottom of the mountain and says, "Stay here. The boy and I will go worship and we will return to you." He uses the plural.
Wait, so he fully expects to walk back down with Isaac.
Indeed does.
I love the point philosopher Eleanor Stump makes about Abraham's track record here, because Kant and all these other critics, they treat Abraham like a guy who just heard a random voice for the very first time.
Which just isn't true.
Right. Abraham had a lived history with the divine. I mean, he had already watched God miraculously preserve the life of his other son, Ishmael.
And Ishmael's mother, Hagar.
Yeah. When they were out of water and completely certain to die in the wilderness, he had verified empirical evidence that God preserves life even when the math looks impossible.
And you can actually see that dynamic play out in the original Hebrew of the command itself.
Really? How so?
Well, it portrays a remarkably tender interaction. The phrasing includes a particle of entreaty, which translates closer to please or I beg you.
Wow, so acknowledging the sheer cost of the request.
Exactly. Furthermore, God tells him to go to Moriah. That specific region shares a Hebrew root with the verb to see or to provide.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's the same linguistic root Hagar used when she called God the God who sees. The ultimate provision, the substitute ram, was woven into the very geography of the command.
Okay, I hear that. I hear that Abraham had all these rational reasons to trust and that the text hints at a rescue. But I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because we still have to confront the sheer reality of tying a kid to an altar.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were listening to this as a parent, you're probably thinking about Richard Dawkins' famous objection in The God Delusion.
Yes, the psychological abuse charge.
Yes. Dawkins argues that even if nobody actually died, testing a father or a child this way is profound psychological trauma. He claims it's entirely incompatible with a loving, all-good being.
Right.
And honestly, isn't the sheer unspeakable terror of that moment enough to condemn the entire event?
It is an incredibly visceral objection. I mean, we bring our modern sensitivities about parenting and trauma right to the edge of the text. But when scholars actually analyze the narrative flow of Genesis 22, that trauma is largely a modern projection. There is literally zero textual evidence of psychological cruelty.
Okay, walk me through that. Because it seems impossible that a kid wouldn't be traumatized by this.
Just notice the pacing in the text. Isaac walks calmly beside his father. He observes the situation and asks a highly rational, measured question.
Right, he says, we have the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb?
Exactly. And Abraham gives a calm, assured answer. God will provide, and they continue together. In fact, numerous Jewish and Christian traditions emphasize that Isaac had to be a willing participant.
Wait, a willing participant?
Yeah, he wasn't a toddler. He carried enough wood for a sacrificial fire up a mountain. He had the physical strength to easily overpower a very elderly Abraham.
Oh, wow. Which completely flips the dynamic from, like, a terrifying abduction to a shared profound trial.
It really does.
And regarding Dawkins' abuse charge, there's a brilliant analogy in our research about a master pilot that shifts the paradigm entirely.
Oh, the flight simulator concept. I love this one.
Yes. So imagine a master pilot is training a co-pilot, and mid-flight, the master secretly cuts one of the engines to simulate a catastrophic failure.
Right.
The co-pilot is sweating, terrified, pushed to their absolute psychological limit trying to land the plane. Is the master pilot abusing them?
Not at all, because the master pilot knows they are never in actual fatal danger. He can slip the engine back on at any millisecond.
Exactly. The simulation isn't manipulation. It's pedagogy. It's designed to build a capacity and a character in that trainee that simply could not be forged any other way.
And that maps beautifully onto the Christian theological reading of the text. God, as the author of the test, knew the absolute boundary of the event.
Right, he knew how it would end.
Yes. From the divine perspective, Isaac's life was never truly in jeopardy. And to take it a step further into New Testament theology, God never asked Abraham to do anything that the triune God wasn't willing to suffer himself.
Oh, that's a profound point.
Yeah, in the Christian framework, the Father does not spare himself the agony at the cross that he actively spared Abraham from on Mount Moriah. It portrays a self-giving deity, which is the absolute antithesis of an abusive one.
Okay, but even if we accept that the psychological abuse charge fails, we are still left with a massive problem of trust.
How so?
Well, how could Abraham possibly know that the voice in his head was actually God and not just a delusion? This is exactly where Immanuel Kant steps in with a pure philosophical sucker punch.
Kant's critique is arguably the most famous secular takedown of the story. He argues that the whole event is a catastrophic failure of reason.
Right. Because Kant says that the moral law, what he calls the categorical imperative, that absolute rule against killing, is something we can know with perfect mathematical certainty.
Sure.
But a voice in your head, you can never be perfectly certain where that's coming from, could be a hallucination. Kant argues that your absolute certainty about the moral law must always override your uncertainty about a subjective voice.
Right. He thinks Abraham should have just said, "My reason tells me killing is wrong, so you cannot possibly be God."
Exactly.
But Kant's framework, while incredibly elegant, completely ignores Abraham's actual epistemic situation.
Meaning what he knew and how he knew it.
Precisely. Kant treats Abraham like he is existing in a total vacuum, as if he has no past data to rely on to verify what he is experiencing.
And Eleanor Stump has an amazing counter-analogy for this that just completely dismantles Kant's assumption.
Yeah, she does.
She says Kant treats Abraham like a man walking down the street who is suddenly accosted by a random stranger demanding he do something completely insane.
Right.
And if a stranger asks you to do the unthinkable, of course you say no. But Abraham is not dealing with a stranger.
No, he's dealing with a verified partner.
Yes. Stump compares it to a long-married spouse receiving a startling, incredibly difficult request from a partner whose love, character, and faithfulness have been meticulously verified over decades of shared life.
That's such a good way to put it.
You respond entirely differently to a spouse you trust with your life than you do to a random voice in an alley.
Exactly. Kant strips away the entire history of the relationship to make a neat philosophical point. But you cannot strip away that history because the relationship itself is the very thing giving Abraham the rational warrant to trust the command. He is reasoning from a massive data set of divine faithfulness.
But wait, if we conclude that Abraham was acting rationally within his specific relationship,
Yeah.
that creates a massive problem for another famous philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard. Because Kierkegaard built his whole legacy on the idea that Abraham had to take a blind, irrational leap of faith.
He did. Kierkegaard famously coined the phrase, the teleological suspension of the ethical.
Right.
He argued that Abraham literally had to suspend morality, to step entirely outside of ethics for the sake of a higher religious duty.
And I have a real problem with that idea because it sounds incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're listening to this and worrying about modern cults, this is the ultimate copycat problem.
Yeah.
If we accept Kierkegaard's view that God can just tell you to suspend ethics, what stops a tragic figure like Andrea Yates or some charismatic cult leader from claiming, hey, God told me to do something horrific, I'm just suspending the ethical like Abraham?
It is a terrifying implication, which is why modern scholars, particularly people like R.W.L. Moberly and Eleanor Stump, completely reject Kierkegaard's reading of the text.
Oh, they do.
Yes. They argue there was no suspension of the ethical whatsoever. Abraham didn't heroically defy morality for God. Because of the covenant promises he held, he correctly perceived that God's command and the ultimate moral good were actually aligned.
Okay, but how does that academic distinction actually shut down a modern cult leader claiming God told him to do harm?
It shuts it down because the biblical text rigorously isolates the command. It is entirely bounded.
Bounded how?
Well, centuries after Genesis, the Mosaic Law explicitly and repeatedly outlaws child sacrifice. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it is condemned as an absolute abomination.
Right.
And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 7, God speaks directly about the surrounding nations sacrificing their children and says, it is something which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind.
So the text itself builds a firewall around the event.
Completely. The Akedah is presented as a singular, strictly bounded, non-imitable exception that served a specific redemptive historical purpose. It's the exact opposite of a precedent.
Wow.
Any modern person claiming a similar command lacks the covenant history, lacks the textual guarantee of provision, and is flatly contradicting the established ethical baseline that the text itself later codified.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because even if we accept that it is an isolated event and that Abraham was rational, we still have to cross one final massive philosophical hurdle,
Hmm.
and it's an ancient one, the Euthyphro dilemma.
Plato's famous trap. This is the ultimate question about the nature of goodness itself.
Right. The dilemma asks, is something morally good merely because God commands it, or does God command it because it is already intrinsically good?
Yeah.
Because if something is good just because God commands it, then morality is completely arbitrary. Like, does that mean God could command torturing puppies on a Tuesday and it would magically become good?
Which is horrifying.
Right. But on the flip side, if God commands it because it's already good, then morality exists as an independent rule book outside of God, meaning God isn't the ultimate authority.
It's designed to force you into a corner. Either morality is arbitrary or God is subservient to a higher law.
Exactly.
But the classical tradition, think Aquinas, and modern philosophers like Robert Adams, they refuse the binary. They argue there is a third option.
Okay, what is it?
Morality isn't based on God's arbitrary will, nor is it an independent rule book. Morality is grounded in God's essentially just and loving nature.
Okay, let's linger on this. How does God's nature act as the third option?
Well, think about a deeply loving, healthy parent. They don't wake up and issue arbitrary, capricious rules for their household just to flex their power.
Right.
Nor do they have to consult a parenting manual written by someone else to know what to do. Their rules like look both ways before you cross the street or don't hit your sister, they flow organically from who they inherently are.
Because their nature is to protect and nurture.
In the same way, God's commands are simply an expression of his perfectly good character. He literally cannot command something that violates his own nature, like torturing puppies, because it contradicts who he is.
Okay, I understand the theology there, but let me push back hard on how that applies to Genesis 22.
Sure.
Abraham lived in the ancient Near East.
Right.
Right. A Bronze Age culture completely surrounded by Canaanite tribes that worshiped gods like Molech.
Yeah.
And how did you worship Molech? By burning your children in fire. Isn't it incredibly likely that this entire story is just a hangover from a barbaric culture? Like, just Israel projecting its own primitive, violent norms onto its deity?
You know, you would absolutely think so until you look at how the story ends. Jewish scholar John Levinson provides what I think is the ultimate historical twist here.
Oh, I love a good twist.
He argues that Genesis Comma 2 isn't a hangover from child sacrifice. It is actually a polemic against it.
A polemic, meaning it's a deliberate attack on the culture.
It is a calculated narrative inversion. Abraham walks up that mountain fully prepared to do exactly what all his Canaanite neighbors did for their gods. He is willing to pay the ultimate cultural price.
Right.
But the climax of the story is the radical, world-altering discovery that Israel's God specifically rejects what the surrounding gods demanded. God stays Abraham's hand. God provides his own ram.
Oh, wow. It takes the absolute highest expectation of Bronze Age devotion and just shatters it.
Exactly. It establishes, once and for all, that the God of Abraham does not desire the blood of children. It is the specific text that breaks the surrounding culture's hold on the imagination of Israel.
That is incredible. It totally shifts how you read the ending. It flips from a story of terror to a story of liberation.
It really does.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive today? We have journeyed through some seriously complex terrain.
We really have.
We've learned that moral rules aren't unthinking brick walls. They depend heavily on the factual conditions of the world. We've seen that Abraham wasn't a blind fanatic hearing voices, but a man relying on decades of verified evidence to trust a faithful partner.
Yep.
We've explored how the test wasn't abuse, but a profound trial with a character-building purpose. And we've seen how the text stands as a brilliant ancient rejection of barbaric violence. It's not a story about a capricious deity. It's a story about a provided ram.
It completely reframes the narrative from top to bottom. But before we go, there is one last piece of the text that leaves us with something really profound to chew on for our own lives.
Oh, what's that?
Right after Abraham's hand is stopped, God says to him, "Now I know that you fear God." That's Genesis 22.1 pus. And theologians have wrestled with this line for centuries. Because if God is omniscient, if he knows everything, does he really need to run an agonizing experiment to learn new data about Abraham?
Right, God already knew exactly what Abraham would do before he ever packed the wood.
Which is why scholars argue the phrase, Now I know isn't about acquiring missing data. It's relational. It's about making an internal, invisible reality manifest in the physical world through action.
Hmm.
The test wasn't for God to figure out who Abraham was. The test was the crucible that actually forged Abraham into who he needed to become.
Wow, so it crystallized his character in real time.
Precisely. Which raises a deeply personal question for all of us. Think about the hardest tests you faced in your own life. The moments that pushed you to your absolute limits, where the moral landscape felt totally murky and everything you relied on seemed to give way.
Yeah.
What if those intense trials weren't designed to reveal your breaking point to some outside observer? What if they were designed to reveal to you the ultimate truth of what you actually value, what you actually love, and who you actually trust when the brick walls fall down?
Man, that completely changes how you look at the most difficult chapters in your own story. Thank you so much for coming along with us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep looking past the surface of things, and we'll catch you next time.